Okay, welcome. I'm Bidisha. Good morning, everyone. What I'm going to do here is do an introduction of the winter school and what you're going to do next 3 days. And once we do that, after that we can maybe have a small round of introduction of ourselves, right? So the first thing is why this name, right? Digital and the everyday, from codes to cloud, like what does it even mean, right? So one thing that we thought of doing here is that how our everyday lives have become sort of a series of digital interactions and communications, right? And we don't think of them as digital interactions, it's pretty much what we do every day. So it's not that we think that, oh, we are going to use a technology or we are going to use digital technologies. It's pretty much a part of what we do. So how we can think, if digital technologies have become such an integral part of our life, how do we can go ahead and understand why these technologies work, how do they work, and why they don't work if they don't work, right? So one of the things that we thought that the changes that we are trying to capture here, that we are moving from looking at technology as a tool to looking at technology as more of an experience, right? So we essentially don't understand when your use of technology starts, right? It's already part of your life, part of what you're doing, as I said. So, and another point is that how do we understand the relationship between technology and society? Where the technology starts and the society ends, or where the technology ends and society starts, right? How do we analytically separate them, or can we at all separate them, right? Maybe when we are talking about technologies which are, like, just let me ask you, when I say technology, what comes to your mind, like in general? Like, I think Professor Swami Manohar did a great job of talking about technologies that we don't usually think about these days. So what comes to your mind? Sorry? No, I'm just talking about what is a technology that comes to your mind, in the sense, what is the name of the technology? Internet. What else? Computer. What else? Smartphones. So you always think of it as something that you possess. There is a tangible aspect to it, right? Internet might not have that tangible aspect to it. But again, when you do things in internet, what exactly you are doing on the internet? It's not you're going to the internet to use internet per se. You're going there to do something else, right? And internet is just a mediation of your social communications or any other activity that you want to engage in. So what we are going to do in these 3 days, trying to look at how these two boundaries are sort of very nebulous, the boundaries between technology and society. And with increasing use of digital technologies, with increasing entanglement of digital technologies in our life, we need to understand how this nebulousness is very important, right? To analytically understand the potential, the positive impacts of technology in shaping our society, and also what Professor Manohar was talking about, the negative consequences that it might have, right? So for that, what we will try and do here is to look at digital and the everyday, not something as a social experience or as a technological experience. What we will try to understand how it is a socio-technical experience. I will come to it in a bit, what I mean by socio-technical, but why we want to look at it as a socio-technical experience is because, and that I'll talk about, but before, what is the implication of looking at it as a socio-technical experience? Things we are making, we are not just looking at impact of technology in society, we are trying to understand technology in all phases. So design of technology, deployment of technology, and also use of technology. How all of these are a socio-technical processes, and how then all of these has a very complex nature that we need to understand, right, to see how each of these stages unfolds in their communication or in their interaction with the society. So, what the call for the application also mentioned it. So, we are looking at it from a very interdisciplinary disciplinary point of view, and we have a program which is called Masters of Science in Digital Society, which is a 2-year master's program, which tries to look at some of these issues in a proper course structured coursework program. But in the winter school, what we did last year also, and we are trying to do it this year, that we try and see to take out some of the themes that we talk about in the digital society program and give you a snapshot of how this program is taught, how you learn through this program about interdisciplinary approaches to understand digital technologies in a 3-day sort of a crash course, right. So, now coming back to a bit about what is a socio-technical assemblage. So, it is an open-ended gathering of several different and sometimes contradictory elements, right. So, we are talking about material artifacts, we are talking about text, we are talking about people, we are talking about organization. Now, this can also include things like cities. So, for example, when you are talking about smart cities, right, again you are sort of making the boundary between what is the technology aspect and what's the city and the planning aspect in it by calling it a smart city. Or biological and linguistic elements. The relations between these elements of the assemblage are non-linear, complex and never predictable. But these heterogeneous elements that we are talking about, which might sometimes be actually in contradiction to each other, do form an alliance for a technology to work or for a technology to be appropriated. So, that's why we need to understand how these alliances are formed between these different kinds of actors, right. And the importance of looking at it as socio-technical assemblage is that you give equal agency or equal importance to human and non-human actors who build these complex systems that forms the fundamentals of our digital interactions or digital lives every day. So, moving forward, I will just give a small example, I think I still have time that I can use, of how socio-technical assemblage are usually analyzed, or how it is very much part of, it is an analytical tool, but how it is very much part of our living existence every day. So, one of the readings that are mentioned in this PowerPoint you will see later will also talks about different kinds of ways technologies are appropriated or technologies are deployed. One of the examples that I want to talk about here is electrification project in Ivory Coast in Africa. It's also known as Côte d'Ivoire, that's a French name for it because it was a French colony till 1960. So, until recently villages in Ivory Coast was the village property. They did not have a sense of private property or individual property rights. So, the village had the entitlement of the land and they distributed it, and the elders in the village distributed it amongst the members of the village depending on their need. And this distribution also was not permanent, it was a transitory understanding. So, if your need changes, your usage of land will also change. So, there was no concept of private property. So, when authorities in Ivory Coast, and this is in 1980s, I am not talking about a very far off historical moment. So, in 1980s, when the authorities started to electrify, started thinking about electrifying the entire country and especially in the villages, what they thought, then they need to break this, because they needed to have a lot of land which is stable. The ownership of the land is stable and not transitory. So, what they thought, that they need to introduce this whole concept of private property, which is not a village owning this land, but individuals, right. So, in the process, of course, you can read this paper in details which talks about, but what I want to emphasize here is that in this whole process, in this acquiring of land, how they built it, it was of course, as you can see, if you're trying to change somebody's concept of what is public and what is private, right, it's not going to be easy. So what they did, they actually got people from the villages who have migrated to cities to come back as spokesperson of how good electricity is and how it is going to change and improve their life, and not just having access to electricity, but what are going to be the spillover effects, your education, your health, your daily quality of life, your cooking, and all these things can be improved. So these people, the spokesperson, as the article talks about, played a very crucial role in convincing villagers to make such a fundamental change, right? I don't even know if all of us can understand what does it mean to not have any private entitlement to assets that we have, because we think about it in a very individualistic way. So what happens then, in the process they succeeded to do that, and when they did, it also, the entire land that was acquired, it just not was used for electrification of the villages, but also used for road and other utility services that are, that comes with, that requires this vast piece of public and stable ownership of land. Now, what happened in the process, the impact of it, this is the process through which, so this is the design and deployment, which is a socio-technical process. Now, if I come to use, how it is a socio-technical process or assemblage. In this whole process, so in our notion that how do we see that we are citizen of India? Because as an individual, the state acknowledges my existence, right? So it's my relationship, my individual relationship with the state that makes me a citizen of India, right? So in this whole process, what happens then in the villages, for the first time, this whole notion of individual citizenship right was created. Because now, by owning land as a private property, you are recognized directly by your state, not as a village, but as an individual. And this whole process of building this citizenship and the relationship between the state and the individual was actually mediated through cables, transmitters, and meter, right? And why? Instead of, because in villages in Ivory Coast, a lot of people were not salaried people, so they did not pay income tax, right? So your electricity bill becomes the space where your citizenship rights, right, are recognized. So that becomes a material artifact through which you can claim citizenship from the state, right? So in this entire, so I like this example because it sort of elaborates how both design, deployment, and use of technology is not purely a technical or not purely a social. It's more of a socio-technical experience, or what I am going to call socio-technical assemblage. Now, thinking of every day, that's the theme of our winter school, right? So thinking of every day as a socio-technical assemblage. This is adapted from a source, so they had something else, so I changed it a bit. So what we are going to do here, so this is the sort of axis through which we are going to understand how the socio-technicality of everyday works out. So one side I have kept material and the other is the social, and they do influence each other and they are symmetrical in their importance in this framework. So neither is more important than the other, right? So in this way, what, so how do we think of material? So what would be a material in your understanding? The smartphones, right? So, and the social, so the social is basically the norms and the, the framework, the beliefs, norms, and the customs that we have with which we operate, right? We interact with other human beings. Now the material, when a material is added to that, you sort of changes those norms a bit, right? So I'll give you an example of Facebook. You are friends with people offline, you're friends with people on Facebook, and sometimes they're same people, they're overlapping, right? But your nature of relationship with those people, the so-called friendship, is very different offline and on Facebook, the way you interact, the way you talk to each other. but at the same time it's not completely asocial, right? We call them social communication platform or social media, right? Because they appropriate some understanding of the social norms and the way social relationships are supposed to be, like how friends should talk, right? So it is the interaction between the material and the social that sort of shapes our digital and the everyday. And the other axis, which is territorialization and the deterritorialization, which is very crucial to understand when we're talking about digital technologies even more, right? Why? Because territorialization, which is not purely a spatial concept, so there is of course a space, like a face-to-face interaction would be something territorial. What it does, it also brings homogeneity, right, amongst people. Or the group that are interacting on that, with that technology, you have some sort of connection, and you have some sort of connection which are stable and some sort of homogeneity. With digital technologies, that homogeneity is sort of destabilized. So you might have 750 friends on your Facebook, and they might be from all over the world, and there might be a lot more heterogeneity between you and your friends than maybe your friends in the classroom, right? So that's why this axis is very important when we try to understand how the digital and the social sort of interacts. And this, because if you see this, the arrow between, or the relationship between this y-axis is fraught, because when we make such transitions, there is of course contestations that will take place, right? Because as soon as more and more heterogeneity creeps in, more and more your social networks are destabilized, which the way you knew, right? There will be more space for confrontations, more spaces of contestations, and it also then makes this place a place where there are inbuilt power relations, and there are more and new power relations that will emerge out of this axis, right? And that's where we are talking about it from a socio-technical point of view when I said that there are multiple actors, and these actors are not always in agreement, but still they do form an alliance. And for a technology to work, this alliance has to be built. If this alliance does not exist, technologies will not function, or they will not sustain. So this is the framework within which we are trying to understand who are these multiple actors. So these are the key questions that we are going to look at. So who are these actors which shapes our digital and the everyday, and what are their interests? What is the relationship between these actors? How are they related to each other? Are they all equal, or there are different kinds of power relations that exist between these actors, that one has more voice over the other? And what are their motivations? If they have conflicting motivations, how these motivations are, or interests, are negotiated and then stabilized for a technology to actually take some form, right? So for the example I gave from Ivory Coast, the spokesperson became very crucial for the technology electrification process to stabilize. Otherwise, it was getting difficult for authorities coming from outside and trying to convince a bunch of villagers that what you known as as a village property, you have to give up that. So you're giving up your autonomy on the way your villages are run. Okay, so these are the main questions I think most of the sessions in the winter school will be talking about. I will not take a lot more time. I'll just talk about the last slide. We'll be talking a little bit about what these talks are and how we are sort of organize this. Is the first looking at these major themes which cut across our interactions on the digital everyday, which is algorithm, privacy, and data. And this will be done in a way that it touches upon this, this boundary sort of, or touches upon or transcends this boundary, let me put it this way, transcend the boundary between the social and the technical through each of these themes. So this is what we call the foundations or the basis of our winter school through which we are going to start. And the second half of it, we are going to look at how these three, these algorithms, data, privacy or regulatory framework in general, how these three are sort of manifested or experienced when we are talking about them in specific domains such as health, finance, entertainment or governance. I'll give a couple of examples here. So the first talk, let's say on algorithms, we talks about how what algorithms are, what are their biases that are involved in algorithms and the consequences of algorithms, and also how it should work in a certain kind of policy framework, right. So what are the policy implications for our increasing reliance on algorithm to do anything. And from that we are trying to, the second talk will then move on to talking about how, what do we mean by privacy, what are the ways in which this can be ensured, and what are the ways in which this is also sort of has become a concern for us, right. And the last one in this thematic one is called data and data driven identity, where we are looking at this relationship of again how the the way we consume and produce data, right, ourselves, how does that have an implication for our identity and who we are in this digital age. In the domain, for example, the health, we'll look at how machine learning algorithms are used for diagnostics. Then it will also talk about the question of patient data, questions of data aggregation, question of privacy and anonymity of patient data. In the finance, it will be, the talk will focus on credit scoring algorithms and how the trade-off between credit history and privacy are sort of achieved or decided upon. The one on entertainment will look at how this whole recommendation system that works, and how this news bubbles, the photos, all this data, and how algorithms are sort of working in this social media platforms, and how does that sort of take care of all these three themes that we are talking about. And the last one, which is on governance, which will look at how we interact with the state on a daily basis and how these data algorithms and regulatory frameworks sort of shape those interactions that we have on our interaction with the state, right. So this is pretty much the introduction to the winter school. Thank you for listening and welcome you all to the winter school.